Welcome back to another edition of Bad News, the media criticism show the right deserves. I'm Emily Jashinsky.
And I'm Ben Weingarten.
We're brought to you by the Federalist and the National Journalism Center. Every week, we are here to break down some of the worst performances of the legacy media. And you know what? We have plenty to work with every week. We could do this for 5 hours every day, it feels like. But today, we want to focus in and hone in on, I think, one of the worst examples, but also the most vivid illustration of media corruption, not media bias, media corruption that I have seen in years, maybe ever. It might actually be one of the best illustrations of all time. And that would be the way the corporate media and the legacy media treated the so-called lab leak theory. They kind of gave it that designation about a year ago when it started to become abundantly clear that we needed to pay closer attention and we needed to look much more deeply into what had happened at the Wuhan lab where they were doing so-called gain of function testing that possibly could have had something to do with an outbreak of the coronavirus in Wuhan. Now, the media initially treated this as a conspiracy theory. It treated it as a conspiracy theory for a long time. They treated Tom Cotton, I believe, was it the New York Times, Ben, referred to Tom Cotton as a conspiracy theorist over this, basically smeared and sought to disqualify anyone who floated this theory and said, we need to get to the bottom of it. We need to find more information out. Were we funding this inadvertently or otherwise? And everyone was smeared as a conspiracy theorist. They were smeared as unqualified. They were smeared as reckless with the facts, but in fact, it was actually our media, the very people who were waxing sanctimonious about the facts, that were completely botching the facts and were ignoring the facts and sticking their heads in the sand when it came to the facts. And now the media is ready to treat this very obvious connection between that lab. Do we know exactly what happened? No. But we do know that there's a connection between the kind of research that was doing and the kind of virus that we just dealt with for the past year. So the media is finally ready to treat it as what it deserves to be treated as. Ben, can you just tell me what your reaction has been this week when Dr. Fauci himself came out and said he wasn't ready to rule this out?
Well, I think one of the most telling signs is that of what is actually at play here is that when Dr. Fauci did one of his infamous flip-flops, as he's done on pretty much every single issue throughout this entire pandemic, I actually saw, and I tweeted about this last night, Chinese Communist Party linked publications like the Global Times, for example, came out and attacked Fauci. And that's very telling because throughout most of the pandemic, if you look at what is said in Chinese media, usually they endorse pretty much whatever Dr. Fauci says. So in this instance, I think it's a very clear, interesting, and telling break with the CCP from Dr. Fauci. But level setting this a little bit more broadly, what I think is the real story of this story is that essentially the media, by its own admission, Maggie Haberman, for example, being a perfect representative of this, one of the most vociferous opponents of the Trump White House, but which, we reported on, many of the supposed bombshell stories that oftentimes proves out to be false, misleading, obfuscatory, etc. Pick your adjective. She said essentially, we dismissed the lab leak theory, we in the media, because Trump and Pompeo were the ones who put it out there. And that, what it shows you...
She said that they were, she implied that they were right to ignore the lab leak theory because Donald Trump had politicized it by suggesting it.
Yeah, it's politicized if a president says something. It's really quite remarkable that she's basically being very candid about the fact that the media didn't actually care about investigating any of the myriad data points out there, or even asking the most basic fundamental questions about where this thing originated and, was there a lab there that was engaged in research that could have led to an accidental or otherwise outbreak of it? What has the Chinese Communist Party said about biotechnology and its efforts? What's the past record of the safety protocols or lack thereof within these facilities? The most basic questions that any inquisitive person, forget a journalist, would ask about what transpired here. And basically, she admitted that the media said, we don't actually care about what the data points are. We care about who made the claim. And if these people make a claim, it can't be true or it isn't worth examining. Now, that's one take on it. And to that point, if you think that the media engages in groupthink and it really is largely about the politics of this, the reason, I think, one of the reasons that people in the media industry will tell you that now suddenly the lab leak theory is being treated as plausible when it's been plausible the whole time, and very little has changed in the way of incremental reporting, with the exception of the Wall Street Journal, for example, putting out a report that intelligence officials had found evidence that there were several doctors at the lab who showed signs of serious illness reportedly a month or so before the outbreak really started to be publicly reported, and China disclosed information about it. Is that those like Nicholas Wade, who is, I believe, a longtime New York Times writer in the science area, as well as Donald McNeil, former New York Times writer, wrote these lengthy exposés saying, look, the evidence is pretty compelling that this is at very least a plausible theory, as anyone with two eyes could see. Any sentient being could understand if they set aside their politics, their ideological blinders for the last year. But when people who are considered reputable scientific journalists in the media come out and say, you know what, this theory actually there's some credence to this, then all of a sudden the ice breaks and other journalists are allowed to glom onto it and say, actually, this does seem pretty credible. But that said, I do think there are other questions that we have to ask about it. Like, was it just that this was an orange man bad sort of story and that it had to be memory hold? Is it that they wanted to cover for communist China? We know that many journalistic publications have taken in hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars over the years to run these Chinese Communist Party mouthpiece leaflets, essentially, within their publications, China-backed news in their publications. Obviously, they have journalists that have been in China in the past. So how much of this was kowtowing to the CCP inadvertently or directly at the end of the day? And then, another New York Times reporter who covers the coronavirus tweeted, I think it was yesterday, essentially that ascribing the lab leak theory to what transpired was itself racist or promoting racism. So, there's that meme as well. You can't link this to China, because to link it to China in any form or fashion, when you're talking, of course, about the Chinese Communist Party, which controls the Chinese government here, is racist. So there's that element of this as well. All of it, of course, again, leads to the CCP's benefit, which has been obfuscating and obscuring what transpired from the very start of this pandemic. And so it's quite damning for the media, but there are also national security and foreign policy related implications to all of this. And once again, you see our media effectively serving as de facto mouthpieces for the CCP, which is a running theme that we've covered a bit here. But I think that is a less explored angle of covering up the lab leak theory. It may be inadvertent or unintentional, but it's certainly one of the consequences of it. And let's see what ultimately happens now if we have some journalists doing real work on this. But of course, the evidence of it, to the extent there is evidence, is likely long gone and in some cases potentially literally disappeared. And the last point I'll make is that there were some who sought to memory hold this, I think, by conflating the fact that, of course, there were military-linked scientists at this lab. And then, of course, there was apparently, at least there's the plausible case, that there was an outbreak emanating from this lab. So was this a bioweapon or not? A lot of people sought to dismiss the idea that China would unleash this on the world as a form of biowarfare, as an unhinged, crazy conspiracy theory. But they didn't say anything about the notion of this was a lab leak for any of a number of potential reasons. And of course, it's a plausible theory. And I'm thankful, I guess, that now the media, the establishment thinks it's okay to talk about it. But when are we going to get to the bottom of this? Before we came on today, there was a report. I think the Biden administration put out a statement that they want the intelligence community to look at this more deeply. Okay, but so what? The first thing you did when you came into office, one of the first things was rejoin the CCP-controlled World Health Organization and essentially defer investigation to the WHO and reinstitute the American funding to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars to it. Where was the press asking any questions about that or about Dr. Fauci and public funding of this lab in Wuhan? So many unanswered, so many unasked questions, and it is a massive media failure. It doesn't seem to necessarily be analogous to Russiagate/Spygate in that case, it was clear it was a fallacious narrative, and they continued to propagate it, and they had to keep the narrative up to destroy President Trump. it's not as clear cut that promoting or not promoting the lab leak theory was directly linked to let's ensure Donald Trump isn't reelected, but it's clear there's a political motive behind it.
Well, and take a look at this article that we have up on the screen. Senator Tom Cotton repeats fringe theory of coronavirus origins. That is an article from 2020. It is an article from early 2020, just as we were learning about the coronavirus. And that is amazing to reflect on, because in the moment, the media has its heels dug in so strongly and is so convinced of its own righteousness that anybody who floats alternative theories is immediately shut down. And we're getting a lot of comments right now, and I think understandably so, from people saying, we know. What do we do next? We know that the media is utterly corrupt. And I would say this example is worth kind of pausing to reflect on, because it's like, this is literally the media's job, is to ask very difficult questions of people in powerful positions of governments in powerful positions, and to be skeptical of the way that they are wielding that power and of their official narratives. So if the official narrative coming from the Chinese government, which by the way, we have no reason to trust, is that no, don't look here. It's not here. Look away. Think of something else. If that's their official if that's their official narrative, maybe our media should be rigorously skeptical instead of finding ways to be rigorously defensive of that narrative. They don't even do this intentionally. I'm telling you, I know that we get this question a lot. They actually don't realize that they are spewing CCC propaganda. Some of the higher ups do, because I think, as Ben mentioned, a lot of the motivation here does come from the fact that these people want to keep their bureaus in China, and that is admittedly an enormously difficult thing to do. You have to walk a fine line, because the Chinese government is so hostile to the Western press and to the press in general. So there's no doubt that that's a difficult job, and I hope that some American media institutions are able to keep their bureaus open in China. But that's a huge pressure on a lot of this, and it's how you end up getting people in these positions where they're uncomfortable questioning the narrative. And then it just builds into this groupthink where the alternative is a conspiracy. And that's where our media has landed on now. It's that if you espouse anything that is not that is on the right, let's just say on the right or in the center, or that subverts the sort of Democratic Party narrative or corporate leftist narrative. It doesn't matter if you're a progressive. It doesn't matter if you're conservative. It doesn't matter who you are. If you do that, you are now going to be lumped in as a disinformationist, right? That is the buzzword that emerged from 2020. It's all about everybody now who opposes them is disinformation. This is an excellent political weapon. It's an excellent rhetorical weapon, but it's also increasingly becoming what they actually believe, because they have purged all of their dissenters. If you work at the New York Times, you no longer have Barry Weiss in your newsroom to disrupt your excellent, exciting Slack channel fun of the day. You no longer have Andrew Sullivan at New York Magazine or people like him to sort of go back and forth with and to express skepticism. You no longer have those people in your newsrooms. In some sense, they have self-deported, Barry Weiss being a great example, but in some sense, they're not welcome there. They've been kicked out, or for the good of their careers, they know to keep their mouths shut. So when you have this level of groupthink in the newsrooms, and then you have the funding from China, and you have the sort of monopolism of that leftist from the left on that groupthink, we're in a really dire situation. And something I think Ben and I have touched on more and more recently is the degree to which media corruption and incompetence, because the corruption begets more incompetence, right? They did a terrible job on this story, not just because they're all leftists. They did a terrible job on the story because when everybody in your newsroom is a leftist, you don't ask the right questions and you don't do your freaking job well. And so, it's this level of corruption. It's costing us greatly. It's costing our efficiency as a country, because this narrative was treated as a conspiracy theory for the better part of a year, when nobody was willing to sort of explore it, because they didn't want to be smeared by the media and by the left as a conspiracy theorist. And the few people who did go out on a limb and say, listen, we need to treat this seriously, were in fact treated like conspiracy theorists.
And you know, what's funny about it is that you would think that at least there would be some self-interested people in these newsrooms who would say, you know what, I'm going to dig into this because no one else wants to dig into it. And by the way, the CCP is coming out with theories like, well, maybe the U.S. military concocted this outbreak. When the Chinese Communist Party is doing that, you know they're hiding something when they want to attack you. But even out of their own self-interest, and maybe they felt that they would get axed or they would be lumped in with the conspiracy theorists themselves, but you could make a career just taking the other side of any of these issues that they are so adamant about and just doing basic due diligence and investigatory work and saying, look, there is some credence to this. But the incentive, I guess, to toe the party line is so strong. And maybe, you know, from a really meta political perspective, it's, you know, the Trump administration is hostile to China. This would sort of prove the theory of the case about the malign nature of the CCP and amp up tensions, and that would accrue to Donald Trump's benefit. And so consequently, we can't focus on this and we can't cover it in the way that we should. Maybe that was the calculus that was made, and that's the overarching calculus at the end of the day. But you would think there would at least be someone who out of self-interest would have pursued this. You know, what is the origin of this pandemic that caused us to commit economic and social and cultural suicide for over a year? It's a pretty damn big story. And the fact that none of them were willing to pursue it, I think speaks volumes about them. And if it really was as simple as the Maggie Haberman argument of, well, Trump said it, so we can't pursue it. I mean, my God, is there any more damning indictment than that?
No, seriously. And, you know, it's funny because all of a sudden, I don't know, it was a few months back, a bunch of, I don't know, it was a New York Magazine story that I think really kicked it off, where they actually published, and to their credit, actually published a pretty fair and in-depth investigation of the so-called lab leak theory and determined that it was plausible and that it was credible and worth talking about. Now, that's after spending basically a year saying everybody else was a conspiracy theorist. They have a piece actually now up from Jonathan Chait. I think the headline is just how liberal media convinced everybody this was a conspiracy. I'm pulling it up right now so we have the exact headline. How the liberal media dismissed the lab leak theory and smeared its supporters, by Jonathan Chait in New York Magazine, which is just hilarious. I mean, if even he is saying that, you know that there's a problem here. And so the question, I think, Ben, that we always are asked to address, and again, I've seen this a couple of times in our comments today, what now? You know, what do we do when the media spends all of this time, you know, outright peddling disinformation and smearing people as bigots, smearing people. Here's an example that we've talked about a few times. There's a front line from PBS called China's COVID Secrets. Highly recommend that everyone tunes into it. One of the New York Times' China reporters, who was writing some of the early stories about coronavirus, looks back on her own work in a PBS special, and this basically got no attention, and said she kind of regrets taking the Chinese narrative so seriously, the CCP narrative so seriously early in the pandemic. That's a New York Times reporter admitting to just a huge error, and nobody seems to have to reckon with their errors. There seems to be no lesson. There seems to be no, moment of learning here. There seems to be no moment of reckoning. The media is just going to get away with it. They're going to be fine. They're not going to improve at all. It's the same thing with the Russian collusion hoax, where today I saw a Bulwark piece defending Natasha Bertrand as somebody. Did you see this, Ben?
You just can't make it up.
No, you can't.
Beyond parody.
Natasha Bertrand was being, I think the assertion was, and she's a huge Russian collusion hoaxer, that the assertion was Natasha Bertrand is a victim basically of people who are upset about like real news. I mean, it's truly unbelievable. You're in like the funhouse version of reality everywhere you look now. And so I guess the question is, the media will have no reckoning. This is not something that is going to meaningfully change the press. Their miss on the 2016 election did not change them. If anything, it changed them for the worse. When you have even the Washington Times media critics saying that they screwed up the Russia collusion hoax massively, nothing has changed. They have made myriad mistakes on coronavirus, this being a huge one. Nothing has changed and nothing will change. They continue to get worse, even after these high-profile mishaps that even they admit to, which are not just isolated incidents, obviously. They are endemic. So what next?
Yeah, it's not a rhetorical question. And essentially the media learns all of the wrong lessons. I think that the ideal kind of end state for the legacy media is that these are just huge money losers for wealthy people who own these publications to stoke their egos, but actually have no real influence over the public. Unfortunately, the legacy media remains influential. So it's incumbent upon everyone who sees it for what it is to do a few things. The first is don't take anything that the media reports at face value. Dismiss it, but take it seriously in that it is still influential. Ridicule it with humor if you can, and then vote with your feet. Take your money, your eyeballs. When you talk about the news, reference the other publications that are independent, alternative, that actually have gotten things right, and demonstrate to your friends and colleagues and family that they're getting it right. Put it in your news feeds that the algorithms have to, at least among your social networks, have to focus on them, although they will try to, of course, censor out any conflicting opinion or facts from the prevailing official narrative. But ultimately, it is clear in the polling that the media continues to just decline and decline and decline in terms of whether the American public trusts it. And so I think they hopefully are digging their own grave to a large extent. But that said, wealthy people can continue to fund these vehicles in perpetuity, and unfortunately, they can do a lot of damage while they collapse over a very long, extended period of time. So I'm interested to hear your take on that. And the other question that I want to ask on the lab leak question is sort of why now? You know, I referenced the fact that, yes, there have been established journalists who have come out and essentially said it's okay to dip your toe in the water. This is now, credible people are now behind this. We have enough distance from Trump. We're allowed to talk about this now. But what else? Do they know something that we don't know is coming down the pike that is going to blow this story out of the water completely? Does the Biden administration have some interest in this lab leak theory gaining credibility? I'm curious to hear your thoughts on why now in particular, when not really a lot has changed in terms of what we know. So
as you're saying that, actually, this is sort of my theory. There's two theories that I would have, and I think they're probably both pretty accurate. The first would be to sort of peel back the curtain a little bit. What happens with reporters in DC and in New York, especially when there's a Democratic administration, is that they're suddenly invited to briefings at the State Department and elsewhere where they talk off the record with officials, and they get more information than the general public has. And sometimes they just get suggestions of what that information might be, sort of like heavy suggestions of what's going on without actually getting any facts or details that they can report, but just they sort of can sense, and good reporters can sense where the public, where the officials are going with the information that they're hearing. And so it actually wouldn't surprise me at all if when the Biden administration got its briefings, its intelligence briefings in the State Department and in the White House, given what we know from Mike Pompeo thinks that this lab leak theory is plausible and credible and deserves to be taken seriously. And I assume that's something that, came from his own knowledge of intelligence. So and just given what he was saying early on, I would take that really seriously. And so it wouldn't surprise me if when the Biden administration got the same intelligence, the media in some of these off the record settings started to get a sense that this was more serious than they realized. And because the Trump administration officials had said it initially, they thought, well, this must not be true. Like Maggie Haberman said, because Donald Trump and Donald Trump's officials are saying it, and they're all idiots, so it can't be real. When they were hearing it maybe from the Trump State Department, they probably weren't taking it seriously. If anything, they probably thought it was wrong. And then when they hear it from the Biden department or the Biden officials, it's like, oh, maybe we can start taking this seriously. And the other thing I have, my other theory would just be the most basic one, which is that it has become sort of like more and more obvious. More and more doctors have been, not doctors, but scientists have sort of been emboldened to be like, I'm putting these pieces together. Here's the information. There was that really long Medium post, you remember, that came out a few weeks back that was extremely detailed and persuasive when it comes to this theory. And as that happens more and more, people just sort of, it snowballs, right? Like everyone gets the courage to start saying something. And so it's like just a great illustration of the level of cowardice that exists in our news media. I think it has something to do with that too, just over time. But, I think the sad thing, the solution to me is we all have to sadly just become really good news readers. And that's not something we're used to doing in this country, because in the era of mass media, we all felt that there was a general standard of neutrality and objectivity. Most people understood that the networks leaned left and that the big papers leaned left. But they had, we were operating on the same base of facts and in the same basic reality. And now that that's not happening, I think you just need to, if you want to be an informed citizen, if you want to be a responsible voter, I think actually you just need to learn, you need to spend time learning who to trust. You need to spend time, and that's a really, really difficult task. Like, that's easy to say when you work in media, and it's your job. But if it's not your job, you shouldn't have to spend time figuring out who's lying and who's telling the truth and who's generally good and who's generally bad. But I really think you do now. I think that's just sort of like the reality that we live in. You really have to read people who are liberals, read people who are conservatives, and figure out who the best people are on both sides and weigh what they're saying with each other, because that's where you can sort of start to see the middle ground. The media thinks everyone is stupid. They think all of us are stupid and they don't trust us. That's why they have to label everything as disinformation or bigotry or conspiracy, because they don't trust the public to read information and decide what's true and what's false. But, really, we all can do it if we just take the time, and we're not used to having to do that. But I just think, the sad reality is when people ask, what can we do? I read Glenn Greenwald and Matt Taibbi's Substacks, and then I read what we're publishing at the Federalist. I read what's in the Journal, and I read what's in the Times, and I know the Times is going to do this, and I know the Journal is going to do that, and you just sort of have to put the pieces together and figure it out. I don't know what you think about that, Ben.
Yeah, the left always likes to say, do the work. In this case, unfortunately, it's incumbent upon all of us to do the work. And really the sad thing about it is, as you noted, the press has always had this sort of bias. The arts have always had pretty much a left bias writ large. So it's nothing new in this country. And as we've referenced before, if you go back to the 1700s and the 1800s, the newspapers were explicitly party papers. So it's not like there hasn't been polarization and spin and polemics and all the rest of it in media for, since the beginning of time, essentially. But all of that said, the nature and extent of it now and the shamelessness and shamefulness of the media is something that might be unprecedented in American history. It's clearly doing substantial damage to the body politic in this case and in many other cases as well. It has a massive impact on national security and foreign policy, and protecting the life and limb of American citizens being the most basic duty of government. That is a really corrosive thing for the media to do. Beyond that, the last thing I'd say is it's a sad commentary when you have to think of a lot of these publications as essentially being Pravda, and they're speaking in sort of official party verbiage, tone, theme. But I think that really is the way to think about it. You have to look at it all as sort of a joke, and they're speaking in a coded language for the ruling class, and we should laugh at it in a lot of ways. But there needs to be a translation of it to what it actually means and what they're actually getting at. And that's, in part what this show is about deconstructing the deep state or ruling class media that we now are unfortunately have to grapple with in this country.
And let's just close by looking at another recent example. There was a woman who had been hired by the Associated Press and lost her job last week after some conservative outlets reported on her college activism that was pretty pro-Palestine and anti-Israel, which tips your hat in one direction, but also reported that, she had Black Lives Matter in her Twitter bio and had tweeted about how objectivity is not possible when it comes to the Israel-Palestine conflict. And the Associated Press has a strict social media policy, as most outlets do. They don't always enforce them. In fact, they never really enforce them. That exists to keep up this false pretense of neutrality and objectivity, which, by the way, most of them actually really believe that they adhere to, because they're so deluded and they're so out of touch that they don't realize that they are not neutral or objective. Some of them, as this young journalist did, actually really don't believe in objectivity or neutrality anymore, and that's kind of a war within the media itself. But the media freaked out over this girl losing her job at the Associated Press for blatantly violating their policy that is meant to uphold their standard of neutrality and their pretense of objectivity. So, you know what crushes public trust in media? It's when people claim to be neutral and claim to be objective, but aren't. That's the problem. When readers and viewers figure that out, it completely erodes and shatters their trust in media. It is tearing at our social fabric, and yet everybody in the legacy media jumped to defend this girl vehemently instead of pausing to think, actually, this is the exact reason that trust in media is so low. It's not just because Donald Trump hates the press. It's not just because Republicans are all idiots and the public is stupid. Maybe it actually has something to do with us and us breaking our commitment to the public.
Yeah, it's well said. There's nothing I can add to that except, I'm sure this is going to be conservative cancel culture pouncing and seizing, and that already is a meme. We had a story at the Federalist recently about Nicole Hannah-Jones combating the fact that Nicole Hannah-Jones, of course, the creator of the 1619 Project, the insidious, pernicious, factually, let's just say deficient project out there, that she ended up not getting essentially a tenured position at a journalism school at the University of North Carolina, and that this is a consequence of cancel culture on the right. They're just so dishonest, so disingenuous, and again, they need to be thought of as state media essentially, and it's a sad commentary for the American public, but at the same time, they may well be digging their own graves. So let's hope that their arrogance, their contempt for the American people, their assumption of our ignorance, and then their deep desire to cling to power at any at all costs, in the long run, hopefully ends up allowing them to dig their graves, and that a much better media arises from those ashes. But on the way down, we'll be there to help hold everyone's hand through and engage in these group therapy sessions about our horrible media.
Well, on that note, thank you everybody for watching. We really do appreciate it. We are here every Wednesday and Friday, just breaking down some of the worst behavior that we've seen in the corporate legacy media over the course of the past week. We appreciate you tuning in. We hope that you subscribe. We hope that you send us your thoughts on the show. We hope that you like the show. And please stay tuned for more, because we'll be back on Friday. Until then, this has been another edition of Bad News.